They said she was a murderer. They tied her to a post in the town square like an animal, bruised and beaten, waiting for judgment that had already been passed. The sheriff stood there with a twisted grin, offering her up like livestock at auction. "Choose any woman you want," he announced to the crowd. Most men looked away in disgust or shame, but Jonas Kincaid stood frozen, not because of the woman and her supposed crimes, but because his 5-year-old twin daughters were pulling at his coat, their small voices trembling with absolute certainty. "Papa, that is her. That is the lady from the snow." In that moment, everything Jonas thought he knew about justice shattered into 1,000 pieces. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you are watching from, so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The dust hung thick in the air that September afternoon in 1873, the kind of dust that coated your throat and made every breath taste like desperation. Jonas Kincaid had come to Willow Bend for supplies and nothing more. Horse feed, nails, maybe some peppermints for Elsie and Ivy if they behaved themselves at the general store. It was supposed to be an ordinary day, the kind that blurred into all the others on his quiet ranch outside of town. But the moment he turned his wagon onto Main Street, Jonas knew something had gone terribly wrong. The crowd had gathered in the square like vultures circling carrion. Men, women, even children, pressed together in a tight semicircle, their voices rising and falling in waves of judgment and excitement. Jonas felt his stomach tighten. He had seen crowds like this before. Back during the war, before trials that were not really trials at all, before executions that were more about entertainment than justice. "Papa, what is happening?" Elsie whispered from beside him, her small hand gripping his sleeve. Ivy, always the braver of the two, stood up in the wagon bed to see better. "There are people tied up, Papa. Why are they tied up like that?" Jonas pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of the square, his jaw clenched as he surveyed the scene. "Stay here, both of you. Do not move from this wagon." But even as he said the words, Jonas knew his daughters would not listen. The girls were too curious, too innocent to understand what cruelty looked like when it dressed itself up as law and order. He climbed down from the wagon, his boots hitting the packed earth with a dull thud. The crowd parted slightly as he approached, recognizing him as the quiet horse breeder who kept to himself, the man who had lost his wife 2 years ago and raised his daughters alone ever since. People respected Jonas Kincaid and his silence. They mistook his grief for strength. They nodded at him as he passed, as if inviting him to join whatever spectacle was unfolding before them. And then Jonas saw the women. 3 women stood tied to posts in the center of the square. Their hands were bound behind them, ropes cutting into their wrists until the skin had turned raw and bloody. Their dresses were torn and dirty, their hair wild and tangled. One woman, elderly and frail, kept her eyes closed as if lost in prayer. Another woman, younger with red hair, sobbed openly, her shoulders shaking with each desperate breath. But it was the third woman who caught Jonas and held him there. She stood perfectly still among the chaos. Dark hair fell in tangled waves around her face. Even from a distance, Jonas could see the bruises covering her skin. Purple and yellow shadows bloomed along her jaw. A split lip had barely begun to heal. Dried blood crusted at her temple from a wound that looked recent. But her eyes were what stopped his heart. Her eyes burned with something that was not fear. It was rage, pure, undiluted fury that seemed to dare the entire crowd to look away first. She did not flinch when people shouted accusations at her. She did not cry when someone threw a clod of dirt that struck her shoulder hard enough to leave a mark. She just stood there with her chin raised, staring down the entire town with a defiance that made Jonas feel something he could not name. "Attention, everyone. Attention, please." Sheriff Rogan Hale's voice boomed across the square, and the crowd fell into an eager silence. Jonas felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. Rogan Hale. Of course it was Rogan behind this spectacle. The man had been sheriff for 3 years now, ever since he returned from back east with a badge pinned to his chest and a chip on his shoulder the size of Texas itself. Rogan was the kind of lawman who saw justice as something malleable, something that could be bent and twisted to serve whoever paid him the most or screamed the loudest. Rogan stood on a makeshift platform near the posts, his thumbs hooked in his belt, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He was enjoying every moment of this. That was what made Jonas feel ice cold, despite the afternoon heat. The man was genuinely enjoying this cruelty. "Now I know you are all wondering what we are doing here today," Rogan announced with practiced ease. "And I will tell you plain. These 3 women here have been found guilty of various crimes against the good people of this territory." "Found guilty by who exactly?" someone shouted from the crowd. Rogan's smile widened to show too many teeth. "By me, friend. By the evidence. By common sense and basic decency. No trial," Jonas thought to himself. "No judge, no jury, just Rogan's word against theirs, and nothing more." "The old woman there," Rogan continued while pointing at the elderly woman with her eyes still closed in prayer, was caught stealing bread from the mercantile. "The young redhead was found in a compromising position with a married man. His wife testified to that herself." Then Rogan's finger swung toward the dark-haired woman with the burning eyes. "And this one right here, this is Mara Quinn. She stands accused of murdering her own husband in cold blood just 6 months ago, then lying about it ever since." The crowd erupted in gasps and whispered conversations. Jonas watched the woman called Mara and saw her jaw tighten at the accusation. He saw the way her hands clenched behind her back until her knuckles went white. But she did not speak a single word in her own defense. She did not beg or plead or cry. She just kept staring straight ahead with that terrible, beautiful rage burning in her dark eyes. "Now here is the thing," Rogan said while raising his hands to quiet the crowd. "We could hang all 3 of them today. That would be simple enough. Quick drop, broken neck, problem solved and justice served. But I got to thinking about what a waste that would be. What a waste of potential." The way he said that last word made Jonas feel physically sick to his stomach. "So here is what I am proposing instead." Rogan paced along the platform like a showman working a crowd. "Any man here who wants himself a wife, any man willing to take responsibility for one of these women, can have her right here and right now. No questions asked and no payment required. You take her off our hands and she becomes your problem. Your responsibility. You keep her in line and make sure she does not cause any more trouble for decent folks." And in return, Rogan grinned wide, "You get yourself a wife without having to court her or win her daddy's approval or any of that nonsense." The crowd erupted again, in a mixture of laughter and shock and eager approval from certain quarters. Jonas felt his stomach turn over completely. This was not justice by any measure. This was humiliation. This was Rogan Hale playing God with 3 women's lives simply because he had the power to do so, and no one would stop him. "You cannot be serious about this." Jonas heard his own voice cutting through the noise before he could stop himself. The crowd turned to look at him with surprise. Rogan's cold eyes found his across the distance, and that terrible smile never wavered even slightly. "Jonas Concade," Rogan said warmly, as if greeting an old friend. "Did not expect to see you here today. Thought you preferred the company of horses to regular people." "This is wrong, and you know it," Jonas said, while stepping closer to the platform. "You cannot just auction off human beings like they are property to be sold." "I am not auctioning anyone," Rogan replied smoothly. "I am offering them a chance at redemption, a chance to be useful members of society instead of criminals rotting in a cell or swinging from a rope. Seems merciful to me." "Merciful," Jonas repeated the word with bitterness, coating his tongue. "You call this merciful treatment? I call it practical, Sheriff." Rogan's smile finally faded and his eyes hardened like flint. "Now, if you have a problem with how I run things around here, Jonas, you are welcome to take it up with the territorial governor. Until that day comes, I am the law in Willow Bend. And this is exactly how we are handling the situation." Jonas opened his mouth to argue further, but a small voice stopped him cold. "Papa, please wait." He turned to find Elsie and Ivy standing right behind him, having climbed down from the wagon despite his clear orders. Their golden hair caught the late afternoon sun, making them look like two small angels who had wandered into hell by terrible mistake. "Girls, I told you both to stay in the wagon," Jonas said firmly. "Papa, look at her," Ivy whispered urgently while tugging on his coat sleeve. Her small finger pointed toward the posts, toward the 3 bound women. "Look at that lady right there." Jonas followed his daughter's gaze and realized she was pointing directly at Mara Quinn, the accused murderer with the bruised face and furious burning eyes. "We have to go home right now," Jonas said while reaching for their hands. "This is not a place for children to be." But Elsie grabbed his other coat sleeve with a grip surprisingly strong for such a small child. "Papa, wait. Please, just wait a moment." There was something urgent and frightened and absolutely certain in her voice that made Jonas pause despite himself. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked quietly, while kneeling down to their level. The twins looked at each other and had one of those silent conversations that identical siblings seem capable of having without any words at all. Then Ivy turned back to him with her blue eyes wide and serious as church on Sunday. "Papa," she whispered, "that is her. That is the Snow Lady." Jonas frowned in confusion. "That is who exactly, sweetheart?" "The Snow Lady," Elsie breathed with her voice trembling. "The lady from the snow who saved us." Something cold slithered down Jonas's spine at those words. The Snow Lady. The girls had mentioned her before in nightmares and fevered sleep talk, but Jonas had always assumed it was just a fragment of trauma. A ghost their young minds had created to make sense of the night they had nearly died alongside their mother. It had been 2 winters ago when it happened. Jonas had been away at a horse auction 3 towns over. His wife Sarah had taken the girls into Willow Bend for supplies, planning to be home before dark. But a blizzard had blown in without any warning. One of those deadly storms that could bury a grown man in minutes if he was not careful. Sarah had tried desperately to get the girls home safely, but the wagon had overturned on the icy road about 2 miles outside of town. Sarah had died that night trying to keep their daughters warm. She had wrapped Elsie and Ivy in every blanket and coat she had before the cold finally took her life. But somehow, impossibly, the girls had survived that terrible night. When the search party found them the next morning, Elsie and Ivy were bundled together under a thick woolen blanket that had not belonged to Sarah. They were singing a song no one in town recognized. They had been barely conscious, and suffering from hypothermia and delirious from the cold. But they were alive, against all odds. For weeks afterward, the twins had talked constantly about a woman in the snow, a lady with dark hair who had found them in the storm. She had wrapped them up warm and sang to them until they stopped feeling so cold. The doctor said it was simply a hallucination brought on by extreme exposure, the mind's way of coping with terrible trauma. Jonas had believed the doctor's explanation. He had needed to believe it because the alternative was too painful to consider. The idea that someone had actually saved his daughters and then vanished into the storm without a trace haunted him. "Girls," he said slowly now, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What exactly are you saying to me?" "That is her papa," Ivy insisted, while pointing again at Mara Quinn. "That is the lady who saved us that night. That is the lady from the snow." Jonas looked up at the woman tied to the post. She had not noticed them yet. She was still staring straight ahead with that defiant fury burning in her eyes. But now that Jonas looked more carefully, he could see what his daughters apparently saw. The dark hair they had described in their fevered ramblings. The strong features. Even the way she stood with her shoulders pulled back despite everything that had been done to her. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" he whispered to the twins. Both girls nodded firmly, with tears streaming down their small faces. "She sang to us, Papa," Elsie said. "She sang the song about the stars and the river, and she kept us warm all night long. And she told us to hold on because help was coming in the morning, and then she was gone when we woke up." Jonas's mind raced through the possibilities. If this was actually true, if this woman really had saved his daughters that night, then she had given up her own blanket and her own warmth to keep two strangers alive in a deadly storm. She had nearly sacrificed her own life for children she had never met before. And now that same woman was tied to a post in the town square, accused of murder without any real trial, being offered up like livestock to whoever wanted her. "Any takers out there?" Rogan's voice rang out across the square again. "Come on, gentlemen. Do not be shy about this opportunity. These women need husbands, and some of you could certainly use wives. What do you say?" A few men stepped forward cautiously toward the crying young redhead. Someone else approached the elderly woman, muttering something about needing help with his farm during harvest season. But no one went anywhere near Mara Quinn. No one wanted the accused murderer with the bruised face and burning eyes. "What about you, Jonas?" Rogan called out, spotting him, kneeling with his daughters. "You have been alone for 2 whole years now. Those girls of yours could certainly use a mother figure in their lives. What do you say? Choose any woman you want from the 3. The words were meant to sound generous, but they dripped with mockery underneath. Jonas could hear the implication clearly, that he was desperate enough and lonely enough to take damaged goods off the sheriff's hands without asking questions. Jonas looked down at his daughters. They were clutching his coat and looking up at him with those huge blue eyes that had seen far too much suffering for children only 5 years old. Ivy's lower lip trembled with emotion. Elsie's small voice broke the silence between them. "Please, Papa, we cannot let them hurt her. She saved us that night. She saved our lives." And just like that, Jonas knew exactly what he needed to do. He stood up slowly while his decision settled into his bones like stones sinking in water. He walked through the crowd, which parted before him like the sea before Moses, everyone watching to see what the quiet horse breeder would do next. He could feel their eyes burning into his back. He could hear the whispers starting up like angry hornets disturbed from their nest. When Jonas reached the platform, he looked directly into Sheriff Rogan Hale's cold eyes. "I will take her," Jonas said with his voice steady and clear. Rogan's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. "Which one exactly?" Jonas turned and pointed at Mara Quinn without any hesitation. Her, "I will take that woman." The crowd exploded around them, gasps and shouts, and someone laughing in disbelief at the audacity. Jonas ignored all of it completely. His eyes locked onto the woman at the post. And for the first time since he had arrived in the square, Mara Quinn actually moved. Her head turned slowly until her dark eyes found his across the distance. Jonas saw surprise flash across her bruised face, then suspicion, then something that might have been fear. Not fear of him exactly, but fear of hope itself, fear of believing this might actually be real. "You are absolutely sure about that choice, Jonas?" Rogan asked, with barely concealed amusement coloring his voice. "She is accused of killing her own husband. Bashed his head in with a fireplace poker, they say. You want that kind of dangerous woman around those precious little daughters of yours?" "I am completely sure," Jonas said simply. "Your funeral, then. Or maybe hers. Either way, she is your problem now." Rogan turned to one of his deputies, standing nearby. "Cut her loose from that post." The deputy approached Mara with a knife and began sawing through the ropes binding her wrists. She did not move as the ropes fell away. She just stood there, rubbing the raw, bloody marks they had left behind on her skin. Her eyes never left Jonas's face, searching for something. His intentions, maybe. Or perhaps she was looking for signs of his sanity. Jonas pulled off his coat and walked toward her while the crowd fell completely silent to watch. When he reached Mara, he held out the coat to her. "Here," he said quietly. "You are shaking from the cold." Mara stared at the offered coat like it might bite her if she touched it. "Why would you do this?" she whispered with her voice rough and broken. "Why would you help me?" "My daughters." Jonas glanced back at where Elsie and Ivy stood watching with tears streaming down their small faces. "They say you saved them once, 2 years ago in a blizzard that killed their mother. They say you kept them alive through the night." Something flickered in Mara's dark eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or perhaps a fragment of buried memory. Her gaze shifted to the twins standing there, and Jonas saw her face crack just slightly. He saw something like pain cross her features before she locked it away again behind her walls. "I do not remember doing that," she said, but her voice was uncertain now. "I truly do not remember." "They remember you clearly," Jonas said. He stepped closer and draped the coat over her shoulders before she could protest any further. "That is enough for me right now." For a long moment, they just stood there. Close enough that Jonas could see the full extent of the damage someone had done to her face over recent weeks. Close enough to see the way her hands trembled even as she tried to hold herself perfectly still. Up close, Mara looked exhausted beyond measure. Not just physically worn down, but soul deep tired. Like someone who had been fighting for so long she had forgotten what peace even felt like anymore. "Come on," Jonas said gently. "Let us go home now." He turned and started walking back through the crowd, trusting that she would follow behind him. He heard Rogan's mocking laughter. He heard the whispers and jeers from the townspeople all around them. He heard someone spit on the ground and mutter the word murderer loud enough for everyone to hear. But Jonas did not stop walking. He did not look back even once. And then he felt it. A small hand slipping into his own. Not one of his daughters reaching for him. It was Mara's hand, thin and cold and shaking badly. She gripped his fingers like she was drowning in deep water, and he was the only solid thing in a churning sea. Jonas closed his fingers around hers and kept walking toward the wagon. When they reached the wagon, Elsie and Ivy scrambled into the back and made room for everyone. Jonas helped Mara up onto the seat beside him, acutely aware of how carefully she moved. He noticed how she winced when she bent her ribs a certain way. Someone had hurt her badly, and recently too. The bruises on her face were just the injuries he could see clearly. He climbed up beside her and took the reins in his hands. He clicked his tongue to get the horses moving forward. As they pulled away from the square and away from the crowd and Rogan's mocking smile, Jonas felt Mara's hand slip out of his own. For a moment he thought she was pulling away from him, putting distance between them already. But then he felt a weight settle against his shoulder and realized she had simply collapsed from exhaustion. Her body folded sideways until her head rested against him. She was either unconscious or just beyond exhausted. Jonas could not tell which. Behind him, he heard his daughters talking softly to each other. "Is she going to be okay, Papa?" Elsie whispered with worry in her voice. "She will be," Jonas said, though he had no real idea if that was actually true. "She will be just fine." The ride back to the ranch took about an hour on the dirt road. The wagon creaked along as the sun sank lower in the western sky. Mara did not wake up during the entire journey. She stayed slumped against Jonas's shoulder with her breathing shallow but steady. Occasionally she made small sounds in her sleep that might have been words or might have been expressions of pain. Jonas kept one hand on the reins and the other hovering near her arm. He was ready to steady her if she started to slip from the wagon seat. Behind him, the twins were uncharacteristically quiet. They just watched Mara with those serious, ancient eyes that children sometimes have when they understand more than adults give them credit for. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Jonas's house was modest but solid. A two-story structure he had built himself years ago, weathered by wind and time but still standing strong. Corrals and pastures surrounded it where his horses grazed peacefully. It was not much by some standards, but it was home. It was safe. He pulled the wagon to a stop and carefully shifted Mara's weight. He lifted her down as gently as he possibly could. She stirred slightly in his arms and her eyes fluttered open. "Where are we?" she started to ask, confused and disoriented. Her voice was thick with exhaustion. "It is okay," Jonas said. "We are home now. You are safe here." Mara looked around at the ranch and the house and the twins who were already running ahead to open the front door. Something unreadable crossed her bruised face. Disbelief, maybe, or fear that this was all some kind of elaborate trick designed to hurt her again. "I do not understand any of this," she whispered. "Why would you do this for me? You do not know me at all. You do not know what they say I did." Jonas met her eyes directly. "No, I do not know those things. But I know what my daughters say you did for them. And I know what I just watched that sheriff do to you in the square. That is enough for me right now." He carried her toward the house, and this time Mara did not protest at all. She just wrapped her arms around his neck and held on tightly, her face pressed against his shoulder. Her breath came warm against his throat. Inside, the house smelled like dust and old coffee and the faint scent of lavender from the dried flowers Sarah used to hang in every room. Jonas carried Mara upstairs to the guest room, the one that had been empty since Sarah died, the one he could not quite bring himself to change or use for anything. He laid Mara down on the bed carefully. Immediately, Elsie and Ivy were there, climbing up beside her. Their small hands patted her arms and face like they were making absolutely sure she was real and not a dream. "It is okay now," Ivy said with childlike seriousness. "Papa will not let anyone hurt you anymore." "We will not let anyone hurt you either," Elsie echoed firmly. "You saved us that night. Now we get to save you back." Mara's eyes filled with tears. The first real emotion Jonas had seen from her beyond rage and suspicion. She reached out with shaking hands and pulled both girls close to her. She buried her face in their golden hair while her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Jonas backed out of the room quietly to give them space and privacy. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, just listening. He heard his daughter's soft voices murmuring comfort to this woman they believed had saved their lives. He heard Mara crying in a way that sounded like releasing years of pain all at once. "What have I done?" Jonas thought to himself. "What in God's name have I just done?" He had brought an accused murderer into his home, a woman he did not know at all, a woman whose story he had not heard, a woman whose guilt or innocence was a complete mystery to him still. He had done it because his 5-year-old daughters had pointed at her and said, "That is her with absolute certainty." Because something in his gut had screamed that what Rogan was doing in that square was deeply wrong. Because when he had looked into Mara Quinn's furious, exhausted eyes, he had seen someone who had been fighting a losing battle alone for far too long. Jonas walked downstairs and sank into the chair by the cold fireplace. His head fell into his hands. Outside, the sun finished setting, and darkness crept across the ranch like a living thing. In the guest room upstairs, a woman who had been condemned without any real trial slept fitfully between two little girls who believed with all their hearts that she had saved their lives. And in the parlor below, a man who had lost his wife 2 years ago wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, or perhaps the most important decision he would ever make. Either way, there was absolutely no going back now. The house settled into silence around him. It was broken only by the occasional creak of old wood and the distant sound of horses moving in their stalls outside. Jonas sat there until full dark surrounded him. He stared at nothing while thinking about justice and mercy and the strange, terrible lottery that had brought Mara Quinn to his doorstep. Tomorrow he would have questions that needed answers. Tomorrow he would need to figure out what happened next, how to protect his daughters, what to do about the town's whispers that would surely come, how to handle Rogan's inevitable interference in their lives. But tonight, just for this one night, Jonas would let them all rest peacefully. He would let the woman upstairs sleep without fear for once. He would let his daughters feel like heroes who had saved their own hero. And he would let himself believe, just for a moment, that sometimes the right choice and the crazy choice were exactly the same thing after all. The last thing Jonas heard before exhaustion finally pulled him under was the sound of soft singing drifting down from upstairs. An old melody he did not recognize, something about stars and rivers and the long road home. His daughters' voices joined in eventually, their high, sweet notes twined around Mara's deeper tones in unexpected harmony. And despite everything that had happened that day, despite the accusations and the bruises and the sheriff's mocking laughter, Jonas smiled to himself in the darkness, because for the first time in 2 long years, his house did not sound empty anymore. Morning came too early the next day. Golden light sliced through the curtains and fell across Jonas's face, where he had dozed off in the parlor chair. His neck ached from the awkward sleeping angle. For a moment, he forgot why he was not in his own bed upstairs. Then memory crashed back like cold water over his head. The town square, the ropes binding 3 women, Mara Quinn's bruised face and burning eyes, his daughter's desperate whispers about the snow lady. Jonas sat up quickly and listened carefully. The house was silent except for the usual creaks and groans of old wood settling in the morning warmth, too silent for his comfort. His heart suddenly hammering with worry, Jonas stood and moved quickly toward the stairs. What if Mara had run away during the night? What if she had hurt the girls somehow? What if everything had gone terribly wrong while he slept? He reached the guest room doorway and stopped cold. All three of them were still there, tangled together in peaceful sleep. Elsie had her small arm thrown across Mara's waist protectively. Ivy's golden head rested on Mara's shoulder, and Mara herself lay on her back with one hand curved protectively around each girl. Her face was finally relaxed, in true rest, for what might have been the first time in months. The morning light caught the bruises on her jaw and turned them purple and green, but her expression was peaceful in a way that made Jonas's chest ache with unexpected emotion. He backed away carefully so as not to wake them. He headed downstairs to start coffee and think about what came next. His hands shook slightly as he worked the grinder. The sharp smell of coffee beans filled the kitchen. What was he supposed to do now exactly? He had acted purely on instinct yesterday, on faith in his daughter's conviction about this woman. But in the harsh light of morning, reality pressed in hard. He had brought a stranger into his home, an accused murderer at that. He knew absolutely nothing about her except that the town had condemned her and his children believed she had saved them 2 winters ago. The coffee was just beginning to boil on the stove when Jonas heard footsteps on the stairs. Light, hesitant footsteps that paused halfway down, as if the person making them was considering retreat back to the safety of the room above. "Coffee is almost ready if you want some," Jonas called out gently. He kept his voice non-threatening and calm. The footsteps resumed after a moment. Mara appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his coat over her torn, dirty dress. Her dark hair hung loose and wild around her shoulders. In the full daylight, the damage to her was worse than Jonas had realized the day before. Not just the bruises on her face, but the way she held herself, favoring her left side carefully. The raw rope burns circling her wrists like grotesque bracelets made of pain. Dark shadows under her eyes that spoke of weeks without proper sleep. "The girls are still asleep upstairs," she said quietly. Her voice was rough, like someone who had spent years screaming and had only recently learned to whisper again. "Good. They need the rest after yesterday." Jonas poured 2 cups of strong black coffee. He slid one across the table toward where Mara stood uncertain. "You should sit down. You look like you are about to fall over from exhaustion." Mara hesitated for a long moment. Then she lowered herself carefully into the chair. Each movement was deliberate and pained. She wrapped both hands around the warm cup but did not drink from it. She just stared into the dark liquid like it might hold answers to questions she was afraid to ask. "I should go," she said finally. "This was kind of you. What you did yesterday was kinder than I deserved. But I cannot stay here with you and those girls. It is not safe for any of you." "Safe from what exactly?" Jonas asked. He sat down across from her at the table. Mara looked up at him. Jonas saw the exhaustion behind her eyes clearly now. Not just physical tiredness, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been running for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stop and rest. "Safe from me," she said, "from what people think I am, from what I might actually be." Jonas met her gaze directly. "Did you kill your husband, Mara?" The question hung between them like smoke in still air. Mara's jaw tightened. For a moment Jonas thought she would refuse to answer at all. Then she laughed. A short, bitter sound that had nothing to do with actual humor. "Does it even matter what I say? The town has already decided that I did it. Sheriff Rogan has already decided. Even if I stood in that square yesterday and swore on every Bible in the territory, they would not believe a single word I said." "I am not asking what the town believes," Jonas said quietly. "I am asking what is actually true." Mara stared at him for a long moment. She was searching his face for something. Judgment, maybe. Or the inevitable moment when he would realize his mistake and throw her out of his home. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. My husband's name was Thomas Quinn. We had been married for 3 years when he died. He was a good man when I first met him. Funny and gentle and full of big dreams about the life we would build together in the West. She paused, and her fingers tightened around the coffee cup until her knuckles went white. But after we married, after we moved out here to this territory, something changed in him. Or maybe nothing changed at all. Maybe I just finally saw what had always been there underneath his charm all along. Jonas stayed completely silent. He let her tell it at her own pace without interruption. He drank, Mara continued. Not at first, but more and more as the years went on out here. And when Thomas drank, he got mean. He would say terrible things to me, break things around the house, and then it was not just things anymore. Then it was me he was breaking. The words fell into the quiet kitchen like stones dropping into still water. Jonas felt his hands curl into fists under the table. He had seen this kind of thing before, during the war and after it. Men who took their anger and their fear and their shame out on the people who could not fight back against them. 6 months ago, Mara said with her voice steadier now, Thomas came home drunk one night. Drunker than I had ever seen him before. He was angry about something. Money, maybe. Or the way I had looked at another man in town. I do not even remember what set him off exactly. She stopped speaking. She pressed one hand to her bruised ribs as if the memory itself caused her physical pain. He came at me with his fists that night, she continued. And I ran. I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom. But Thomas broke down the door like it was made of paper. I grabbed the fireplace poker because it was the only weapon I had within reach. I held it up and told him to stop. I told him I would use it if I had to. Mara's voice cracked with emotion, and Thomas just laughed at me. He laughed and said, "Go ahead and try it then," and he kept coming toward me. So I swung the poker at him as hard as I could, but I missed. I swung and missed, and the poker flew out of my hands and hit the wall behind him. And then he was on top of me, choking me, telling me he was going to kill me that night, that I was worthless, that nobody would miss me when I was gone. Her hand pressed against her mouth as if to hold back a scream. I remember his hands around my throat, she whispered through her fingers. I remember not being able to breathe. Everything was going black at the edges. And then there was a gunshot. Just one single shot. Mara looked up at Jonas, with her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thomas's hands went slack on my throat. He fell on top of me like dead weight. There was blood everywhere suddenly, so much blood I could taste it. I pushed him off me and saw the hole in the back of his head. And when I looked up at the doorway, Sheriff Rogan was standing there with a smoking gun in his hand. Jonas felt ice slide down his spine at those words. "Rogan shot Thomas," he said slowly. "He saved my life that night." Mara's voice had something strange in it now, something that did not match the words she was saying. That is what Rogan told me anyway. He said he had heard the commotion from outside, that he came to investigate because it was his duty. He said he saw Thomas attacking me through the window and shot him to save me. "But you do not believe that story," Jonas said with understanding beginning to dawn. Mara's laugh was hollow and bitter. I was grateful at first. I thanked Rogan. I cried on his shoulder like a fool. And then he said something that changed everything. Her voice dropped so low Jonas had to lean forward to hear her clearly. Rogan said that I owed him now. He said that saving my life made us connected in a special way. He said Thomas was a drunk and a fool who did not appreciate what he had. But Rogan would appreciate me properly if I would just be grateful to him in the right way. The implication of those words hung in the air like poison. I told him no, Mara continued firmly. I told Rogan I was grateful for saving my life, but I was not interested in that kind of arrangement. And he smiled at me, this cold, terrible smile that made my skin crawl just to see it. And he said, "That is unfortunate." Just like that. 2 words. That is unfortunate. She took a shaky breath before continuing. 2 days later, Rogan came back to my house with his deputies. He said there were witnesses who saw me fighting with Thomas earlier that day. He said the angle of the bullet wound was all wrong for someone shooting from the doorway like he claimed. He said maybe I had shot Thomas myself and was trying to blame it on a lawman to save my own neck. Mara's eyes burned with that same fury Jonas had seen in the town square. Rogan arrested me and put me in a cell. He let the whole town believe I was a cold-blooded murderer. And every single time he came to bring me food or water over the past 6 months, he would ask if I had changed my mind about being grateful to him yet. Every single time, without fail. Jonas felt sick to his stomach. I refused him every time, Mara said with steel in her voice. Even when he started beating me for refusing. Even when he told me I would hang if I did not cooperate with him. I would rather die than let that man touch me. So Rogan found another way to punish me instead. The post in the town square, Jonas said quietly. Offering you up like livestock to anyone desperate enough to take you. He thought he was being generous about it, Mara said bitterly. Thought some desperate man would claim me and then at least I would not hang. But Rogan made absolutely sure everyone knew what I was accused of. He made sure no decent man would want anything to do with me. He thought I would watch them take the other women and leave me standing there alone until I finally begged him to save me, to take me himself rather than face the noose. But my daughters pointed at you instead, Jonas said softly. Mara's expression cracked. Something vulnerable showed through her defenses for just a moment. I do not understand why they did that. I truly do not remember saving anyone that night in the storm. I mean, I remember a blizzard 2 winters ago. I remember being caught out in it. I remember finding something in the snow. But everything after that is completely blank in my memory. I woke up 3 days later in a neighbor's barn with a concussion and frostbite on my hands and feet. They said I had been found unconscious on the road, half frozen to death. I lost most of that winter to fever and confusion afterward. If I did save your daughters that night, I honestly do not remember doing it. They remember you clearly, Jonas said. They remember the song you sang to them. Mara's hand froze on the coffee cup. Her face went pale. What song do they remember? She asked, barely above a whisper. Something about stars and a river, Jonas said, and finding your way home in the darkness. Mara's eyes went distant. That is my mother's song, she said softly. She used to sing it to me when I was a little girl. I do not even remember all the words anymore, but sometimes when I am scared or cold, I find myself humming that melody without thinking about it. The twins said, "You wrapped 'em in a blanket to keep 'em warm," Jonas continued. Sarah was already gone when the search party found them the next morning, but the girls had a blanket nobody recognized. They kept saying a dark-haired lady had given it to them and told them to hold on until morning. Mara's eyes went distant like she was trying to grasp at smoke and memories. I had a blanket that winter, she said slowly. Wool, dark green color. My grandmother made it for me when I was young. I loved that blanket more than almost anything I owned." She looked at Jonas with confusion and wonder mixing on her bruised face. "I never knew what happened to it. After I woke up from the fever, it was simply gone. I assumed I had lost it somewhere in the storm." They sat in silence for a long moment. The morning sun grew stronger through the kitchen windows. Somewhere outside, a rooster crowed loudly. Jonas could hear his horses moving in their stalls, stamping and snorting, ready for their breakfast. "So what happens now?" Mara finally asked. "You know what people think I am? You know Rogan will make your life miserable for taking me from that square. You know I might be dangerous. I might be exactly what they say I am. I might not remember what really happened correctly." Jonas stood from the table and refilled his coffee cup. He took his time before answering, choosing his words carefully. What did he really know about this situation? He knew the town had condemned this woman without any proper trial. He knew Sheriff Rogan Hale was exactly the kind of man who would use his badge as a weapon against vulnerable people. He knew his daughters, who never lied about important things, who saw the world with a clarity most adults had lost somewhere along the way, believed absolutely that this woman had saved their lives. And Jonas knew, looking at Mara Quinn sitting at his kitchen table with rope burns on her wrists and bruises covering her face, that she had been fighting her own private war for months and had not broken yet. Despite everything Rogan had done to her. "Now you stay here," Jonas said firmly while turning back to face her. "You rest, you heal, and we figure out the rest of it together as we go along." Mara started to protest. "You cannot just decide to help me like this." "I already did decide," Jonas interrupted gently but firmly. "My house, my choice. And I am choosing to believe my daughters know exactly what they are talking about." The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm at the ranch. Mara moved through the house like a ghost at first, silent and careful about everything she did, as if she was afraid that breathing too loudly might shatter whatever fragile grace had brought her to this place. She slept in the guest room, but spent most of her nights sitting in the chair by the window, watching the darkness outside, expecting Rogan or angry townspeople to come with torches and ropes at any moment. But no one came to disturb them. The ranch was too far from town, too isolated for casual visitors to bother making the journey. The only sounds at night were coyotes in the distance and wind moving through the cottonwood trees along the creek. Jonas worked with his horses during the long daylight hours, and Mara slowly began to move around the house during that time, doing small things at first, washing dishes that had piled up, sweeping floors that had not been properly cleaned in months, mending the girls' clothes that had been waiting in a basket since before Sarah died. "You do not have to do any of that," Jonas told her one afternoon. He found her bent over a pair of Ivy's boots, stitching up a split seam with careful, precise movements. "I need to do something useful," Mara said without looking up from her work. "If I just sit around thinking, I remember too much. If I remember too much, I cannot breathe properly." So Jonas let her work. He watched her repair clothes with stitches so small and even they looked like machine work. He watched her brush the girl's hair each morning with hands that were gentle as she worked through the tangles. She hummed that old melody while she worked, the one about stars and rivers that the twins claimed to remember from the worst night of their young lives. He watched her teach the girls new things, how to knead bread dough properly until it was smooth and elastic, how to identify edible plants in the wild from the poisonous ones that looked similar, how to move quietly through the world without drawing unwanted attention to yourself. "Where did you learn all of these skills?" Jonas asked one evening. They sat on the porch watching the sun set while the girls played in the yard. "My mother taught me most of it," Mara said. Her hands were busy braiding leather into a bracelet for Ivy. "She died when I was 12 years old. After that, it was just my older brother Rowan and me trying to survive on our own." Her voice went distant with memory. "Rowan was 5 years older than me. He practically raised me after Mama passed. He taught me to read properly, to think for myself, to stand up for what I believed even when it was hard. Rowan always said that knowledge was the only thing nobody could ever take from you, not even with a gun pointed at your head." "Where is your brother now?" Jonas asked carefully. Something flickered across Mara's bruised face. Pain and longing and shame, all mixed together. "I do not know where Rowan is anymore," she admitted. "We had a terrible fight before I married Thomas. Rowan did not like him from the very start. Said he could see something wrong underneath all that charm. I did not listen to my brother's warnings. I told Rowan that if he could not be happy for me, then I did not want him around anymore. And so Rowan left, just like I asked him to. I have not seen him or heard from him since that day." "Did you ever try to find him and apologize?" Jonas asked gently. "How could I?" Mara's laugh was bitter and sad. "I was trapped in a bad marriage first, then trapped in a jail cell. I was never free to go searching for anyone." She looked down at her hands and the leather braid taking shape between her fingers. "Besides, after what happened with Thomas, after the accusations Rogan made against me, maybe it is better that Rowan does not know where I am. Better that he is not connected to this whole terrible mess I have made of my life." Jonas wanted to argue with her, but he understood that kind of protective isolation all too well. After Sarah died, he had pushed away friends and family, anyone who might need something from him that he did not have the strength to give. Sometimes loneliness felt safer than the alternative of letting people close again. 3 weeks passed peacefully. Spring deepened into early summer on the ranch. The land bloomed with wildflowers and new grass that seemed to grow overnight. The horses grew sleek and healthy in the warm weather, and the girls laughed more than Jonas had heard in 2 long years. Elsie and Ivy followed Mara everywhere she went, peppering her with endless questions, demanding stories and songs and lessons about everything under the sun, and Mara began to change in response to their attention. The hardness in her eyes eased slightly. She smiled occasionally now. Small, uncertain smiles that looked out of practice, but genuine nonetheless. She started eating more at meals, sleeping better through the nights. The bruises on her face faded from purple to yellow to green, then slowly disappeared entirely until her skin was clear again. But the peace could not last forever. Jonas knew that deep in his bones. He just did not know how quickly it would shatter around them. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late June. Jonas was in the barn checking on a mare who had seemed off her feed that morning. He was feeling her belly for any signs of colic when Elsie came running through the barn doors. Her face was white with panic. Papa, come quick. Ivy is really sick." Jonas dropped everything and ran toward the house. He found Ivy in the parlor, curled up on the sofa. She was shaking violently despite the warm summer evening. Her face was flushed bright red with fever. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused, like she could not see what was right in front of her. Mara was already there beside her. One hand pressed against Ivy's forehead. Her face was tight with worry. "How long has she been like this?" Jonas demanded while kneeling beside his daughter. It came on very fast, Mara said. She was completely fine just an hour ago, playing in the yard with her sister like always. Then she said she felt cold suddenly. Now she is burning up with fever. Jonas touched Ivy's forehead and felt the heat radiating from her skin. Too hot, dangerously hot for a child her age. Ivy, sweetheart, can you hear me talking to you? I am so cold, Papa, Ivy whispered weakly. So cold everywhere. Where is the blanket? Where is the lady's blanket? Jonas felt his blood turn to ice at those words. What did she just say? He asked Mara. The blanket, Ivy mumbled with her eyes rolling. The green blanket. So warm and soft. She sang about the stars and the river and finding home. She is delirious from the fever, Mara said quickly, but her voice was shaking now. It is just the fever talking. It does not mean anything. But then Elsie gasped from the doorway where she stood watching. Papa, I do not feel good either. Jonas turned just in time to see his other daughter swaying on her feet. Her face had gone completely pale in seconds. Before he could move to catch her, Elsie's eyes rolled back in her head and she crumpled toward the floor. Mara lunged across the room and caught the falling child just before she hit the ground. Get them both upstairs right now, Jonas ordered. His voice was calm, but his hands were shaking badly. Both of them. We need to bring these fevers down immediately. They worked through the entire night together. Jonas ran back and forth with cold water and clean cloths while Mara sat between the two beds in the girls' room. She bathed their burning skin with wet rags. She held them close when they thrashed and cried out. She sang that old melody over and over because it seemed to be the only thing that calmed their fevered minds. But as the hours wore on and the fevers refused to break, the twins began to mumble words in their delirium, disjointed fragments of memory, things that made no sense to Jonas but seemed to mean everything to Mara. The snow was so deep, Ivy whispered, with her eyes closed tight. So much snow everywhere, Mama is not moving anymore. Why is Mama not moving, Papa? We have to stay warm, Elsie moaned from the other bed. Have to hold on tight. The lady said help is coming. She promised us help was coming if we just held on. The stars are so pretty tonight, Ivy said with tears streaming down her fevered face. She is singing about the stars. Do not stop singing, please. Please do not ever stop. The blanket is green, Elsie mumbled. Soft and green and warm. But she is shaking so hard now. Why is she shaking if she has the blanket? She gave us the blanket, Ivy said. She is not wearing it anymore. She gave it all to us instead. Mara's hand froze on the wet cloth she was wringing out. Jonas watched her face go completely white in the candlelight. Something was happening. The fever was unlocking memories. Not just in the girls, but in Mara as well. Oh God, Mara whispered suddenly. Her voice cracked with emotion. Oh God, I remember now. I remember everything. Mara looked at Jonas with wide, horrified eyes that were filling with tears. I remember that night now, she said. Her voice was shaking badly. I remember the storm. I remember everything that happened. The storm, Jonas said slowly. You remember saving the girls. Mara nodded while tears streamed down her face. Her whole body was trembling. I was traveling that night, she said, trying to get to the next town before the blizzard hit. But I did not make it in time. The snow came too fast. I took shelter under a big tree and waited for the worst to pass. She pressed her hands against her eyes like she was trying to block out images only she could see. Then I heard crying. Children crying somewhere in the storm. I followed the sound through the snow. It took forever to find them. And when I did, I found two little girls huddled together next to an overturned wagon, next to a woman who was not moving anymore. Mara's voice cracked completely. I knew the woman was already dead. I could tell just by looking at her. And I knew those girls would be dead too if I did not do something immediately. They were already turning blue from the cold. Jonas felt his own eyes burning with tears. He did not try to stop them. I only had one blanket with me, Mara continued. My grandmother's blanket, the one I had carried with me everywhere since I was a child. I wrapped those girls up in it as tight as I could. I sang to them because I did not know what else to do, because they were so scared, and I needed them to stay calm, to stay awake, to keep breathing. How long did you stay with them that night? Jonas asked. His voice came out rough with emotion. Hours, Mara said. I do not know exactly how long, until I could not feel my hands anymore, could not feel my feet, until everything started going black at the edges of my vision. The last thing I remember is lying down next to them, trying to keep them warm with my own body heat, trying to give them everything I had left. She looked up at Jonas with devastated eyes. I thought they died that night. I woke up days later in someone's barn, half dead from exposure myself. I asked everyone about the children I had found, but nobody knew what I was talking about. Nobody had seen any children in the storm except me. Mara pressed her hands to her face. I thought the cold had made me imagine the whole thing. I thought my mind had invented a story where I tried to save someone because I could not live with the alternative. I thought I had failed them. I thought they had frozen to death because I was not strong enough to save them. They are real, Jonas said while moving to sit beside her. He took her, shaking hands in his own. They survived that night because of you. You gave them your blanket, your warmth, everything you had, and they lived because of your sacrifice. She is so cold, Ivy mumbled from her bed. Do not be cold any more, lady. Take the blanket back, please. Cannot take it back now, Elsie whispered from the other bed. Cannot ever take it back. It is ours now. She gave it to us forever. Mara made a broken sound deep in her throat. She buried her face against Jonas's shoulder and sobbed. Great, gasping cries that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wounded inside her. He held her while she cried, while his daughters burned with fever and remembered the night a stranger had loved them enough to freeze. Dawn was breaking outside when the fevers finally peaked and broke. Both girls opened their eyes, clear and focused again. Soaked with sweat from head to toe, but alive and conscious and safe. Papa, Ivy whispered weakly. What happened to us? You were very sick, baby girl, Jonas said while brushing damp hair back from her forehead. But you are going to be okay now. Both of you are going to be just fine. Elsie's eyes found Mara sitting between their beds, exhausted and tear-stained, but still there watching over them. You stayed with us all night, Elsie said. You did not leave us. Of course I stayed, Mara said. Her voice was hoarse from crying and singing and praying through the long night. Where else would I possibly be? In the snow, Elsie said seriously. You stayed with us in the snow that night too, even when you were so cold, even when you did not have your blanket anymore. You stayed with us until morning. Mara's breath caught in her chest. You really remember that night? She asked. You really remember me being there? We always remembered you, Ivy said from her bed. But Papa did not believe us at first. The doctor said we probably just dreamed the whole thing. You did not dream it, Mara whispered. Her voice cracked with emotion. I was really there. I promise I was there that night." "We know you were," the twins said together. They reached for Mara with small, certain hands. Jonas stood up slowly and backed out of the room. He needed to give them space. He needed to give himself space to process what had just happened. He walked downstairs on shaking legs and collapsed into the parlor chair. The same chair where he had dozed off that very first night Mara came to stay with them. The same chair where he had made the decision to walk into that town square and claim a woman everyone else had abandoned. Now he finally understood why the girls had recognized Mara immediately, why they had pointed at her with such absolute certainty that day in the square. They had not just recognized her face, they had recognized her sacrifice. They had carried the memory of it in their bones, even when their conscious minds struggled to believe what their hearts knew to be true. Mara had given everything she had to save two strangers in a storm, and now by some strange grace or fate or cosmic justice, those same two strangers had saved her right back. Jonas put his head in his hands and allowed himself to cry. He cried for his wife Sarah, who had died trying to save their daughters that terrible night. He cried for his children who had survived against impossible odds. He cried for the woman upstairs who had forgotten her own heroism until fever brought the memories flooding back. He cried for all of it. Great heaving sobs that shook his shoulders and left him feeling hollowed out, but strangely clean when they finally stopped. When Jonas finally looked up again, the sun was fully risen outside, painting the world in shades of gold and new beginnings. He could hear voices upstairs. Mara's voice was low and gentle. The twins' voices were high and bright. All three of them were laughing about something he could not quite hear. Jonas stood and walked to the window. He looked out over his ranch, his horses, his land. This place had been a tomb for 2 long years, a monument to grief and loss that he had not known how to escape. But somehow, in the space of just 3 weeks, it had become something else entirely, something that felt dangerously and impossibly like hope again. The peace lasted exactly 6 more days before Sheriff Rogan came to destroy it. Jonas first heard the whispers when he went into town for supplies the following week. He had run low on flour and coffee and a few other necessities that the ranch could not provide on its own. The moment he walked into the general store, conversation died like someone had snuffed out a candle. Men who had known Jonas for years suddenly found urgent business studying their boots. Women whispered behind their hands and looked away when he tried to meet their eyes. "Morning, Martin," Jonas said evenly to the store owner. He refused to acknowledge the uncomfortable silence. "Jonas." Martin Cooper's voice was careful and neutral. He measured out the flour without meeting Jonas's eyes. "Heard your girls took sick last week. Hope they are feeling better now." "They are recovered completely. Fever broke clean and they are running around like nothing happened." "Good. That is good to hear." Martin tied off the flour sack with quick, efficient movements. Then he glanced up with something in his eyes. Not quite pity, not quite warning, but somewhere in between. "Folks are talking about you, Jonas, saying maybe you did not think things through properly, saying maybe you are putting those girls of yours in danger by having that woman around. Folks should mind their own business," Jonas said quietly, but there was steel underneath his words. "Maybe so. But when a man brings home a woman accused of murder, folks tend to get nervous about it, especially when there are innocent children involved." Jonas picked up his supplies and counted out coins on the counter. "The woman's name is Mara, and she is no more a murderer than you or me." "You sure about that?" The new voice came from behind Jonas. He did not need to turn around to know who it belonged to. He would recognize that smooth, confident drawl anywhere. Sheriff Rogan Hale stood in the doorway of the general store. One hand rested casually on his gun belt. His badge caught the morning sunlight streaming through the window. He smiled like they were old friends meeting by chance, but his eyes were cold and calculating as a snake. "Sheriff," Jonas said flatly. Jonas Kincaid. Rogan stepped fully into the store. The few remaining customers suddenly remembered they had business elsewhere. Within moments, Jonas and Rogan were alone, except for Martin, who had gone very still behind his counter. "Been meaning to ride out to your place," Rogan continued. "See how you are settling in with your new domestic arrangement." "We are settling in just fine," Jonas said. "Do not need anyone checking on us." "See, that is where you are wrong about things." Rogan's smile widened, but his eyes stayed dead and cold. "When a man takes custody of a known criminal, that becomes my business as sheriff. That becomes the whole town's business, really. Especially when that criminal might be a danger to innocent little children." "She is not a danger to anyone," Jonas said firmly. "You sound mighty certain about that. Tell me, Jonas, what exactly do you know about Mara Quinn, besides whatever sad story she has told you, which I am guessing was quite the tale of woe?" Jonas shifted the supplies in his arms. He used the movement to put more distance between himself and the sheriff. "I know enough," he said simply. "Do you know she and Thomas fought constantly before he died? That neighbors heard her threatening to kill him more than once? Do you know she was found standing over his dead body with his blood on her hands, with the murder weapon right there on the floor where she dropped it?" "I know you were the one who actually shot Thomas," Jonas said quietly. He watched Rogan's smile freeze on his face. "I know you killed Thomas Quinn that night," Jonas continued. "Then you tried to use that as leverage to get what you really wanted from his widow. When Mara refused your advances, you framed her for murder to punish her. The silence that followed was thick and dangerous as a coiled rattlesnake." Martin made a small sound behind his counter, quickly stifled. Rogan's hand drifted closer to his gun. Jonas tensed, ready to drop the supplies and defend himself if necessary, but Rogan just laughed. A cold, amused sound that raised the hair on the back of Jonas's neck. "Is that what she told you happened? That I killed her husband?" Rogan shook his head in mock disappointment. "Jonas, the woman is playing you like a fiddle at a barn dance. She killed Thomas in a fit of rage that night. She panicked when she realized what she had done, and she has been lying about it ever since to save her own neck." "Funny how your story changes depending on who is listening," Jonas observed. Rogan's eyes hardened into something dangerous. "Be very careful, Jonas. You are walking a dangerous line right now, harboring a known criminal, making wild accusations against a peace officer. Those are serious matters that could have serious consequences. Then arrest me for it." Jonas met his cold gaze without flinching. "If I am breaking the law by helping her, if she is the dangerous criminal you claim she is, then do your job, Sheriff. Arrest both of us. Bring us before a judge. Let a jury of our peers decide the truth." "I could do exactly that," Rogan said softly. "But here is the thing, Jonas. I am a reasonable man at heart. I understand you have been alone for a long time since your wife passed. I understand those girls of yours need a mother figure in their lives. So I am willing to overlook your poor judgment in this matter." "Willing to overlook it? How exactly?" Jonas asked. "Send the woman to town once a week to check in with me personally. Let me make sure she is behaving herself properly. That is all I am asking. Just a simple courtesy visit." Rogan's smile returned, oily and knowing. "I am sure Mara will not mind seeing me regularly. She used to be quite cooperative before she got all these grand ideas about dignity and respectability. Jonas felt rage surge through him like wildfire, hot and consuming. His hands clenched on his supplies, hard enough to dent the metal cans. "You stay away from her," Jonas said. His voice came out like gravel. "You stay away from my ranch. You stay away from my family." "Your family?" Rogan raised his eyebrows mockingly. "Jonas, she is not your family. She is a murderer you picked up in the town square like a stray dog with mange. Do not fool yourself into thinking she is something she is not. And do not fool yourself into thinking that badge makes you untouchable," Jonas shot back. "You might have this town scared into silence. But I am not afraid of you, Rogan. Maybe you should be afraid." Rogan's voice dropped. All pretense of friendliness disappeared from his face. "Because here is exactly what is going to happen next. I am calling a town meeting tomorrow night. We are going to discuss the situation out at the Concade Ranch. Let good, decent people voice their concerns about having an accused murderer living among them. And if the town decides that woman is a danger to the community, which they absolutely will decide, then I will have no choice but to remove her from your custody, for the safety of everyone involved. For the safety of those precious little daughters of yours." Jonas took a step toward Rogan. The sheriff's hand closed around his gun. "Do not," Rogan warned. "Do not give me a reason, Jonas. I would truly hate to have to explain to those girls why their daddy attacked a peace officer and ended up in a cell himself." They stood frozen like that for a long, tense moment. The air crackled between them. Then Jonas forced himself to step back, to unclench his fists, to swallow the rage that threatened to choke him. "Tomorrow night," Rogan repeated with satisfaction. "Town hall at 7 o'clock. I expect to see you there, Jonas. Alone. Leave the woman and the children at home. This is a discussion for adults." He tipped his hat mockingly and sauntered out of the store. His boots echoed on the wooden boards until they faded into silence. "Jonas, you just made yourself an enemy of the most dangerous man in this territory." Martin breathed from behind the counter. His face was pale. "I made that enemy the day I cut Mara loose from that post," Jonas said. He threw coins on the counter without bothering to count them and walked out into the bright morning sunlight. The weight of the supplies was nothing compared to the weight settling in his chest. "A town meeting tomorrow night." Rogan was going to turn the entire town against them. He was going to use fear and gossip and self-righteous morality to take Mara away from him, from the girls who had finally found something like happiness again, and there was not a damn thing Jonas could do to stop it. Or was there? An idea began to form as Jonas loaded the supplies into his wagon. It was desperate, probably foolish, but it was the only card he had left to play. If Rogan wanted to put on a show, if he wanted to let the town condemn Mara based on lies and rumors, then Jonas would give them the truth instead. All of it, in front of everyone. He just had to convince Mara to stand up in front of the people who had already judged her guilty and tell her story one more time, with witnesses who could not be ignored. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual. Jonas rehearsed in his mind what he would say, how he would explain that the fragile peace they had built was about to be shattered by a vengeful sheriff. When he finally pulled up to the house, Jonas found Mara in the garden with the twins, teaching them which plants were weeds and which were useful herbs worth keeping, the sight of them together. Mara's dark head bent close to the girls' golden ones, all three of them laughing at something. It made his heart clench painfully. "Papa, Elsie spotted him first and came running. Mara is teaching us about cooking herbs, mint and sage and rosemary and thyme. Ivy held up a sprig of fragrant greenery. "Smell this one, Papa. It is called lavender." Jonas dutifully sniffed the lavender, made appropriate, appreciative sounds. Then he met Mara's eyes over the girls' heads. She read his expression immediately. Her smile faded into concern. "Girls," she said quietly, "why do you not take those herbs inside and put them in water? We will hang them to dry later this afternoon." The twins scampered off toward the house, chattering about their botanical discoveries. The moment they disappeared through the door, Mara stood and brushed dirt from her skirt. "What happened in town?" she asked directly. "Tell me everything." The town hall was packed when they arrived that evening. People spilled out onto the street. Half of Willow Bend had turned out for this spectacle. Jonas led his family down the center aisle. Mara walked with her head high despite the hostile whispers surrounding them. The twins held tight to her hands. Sheriff Rogan stood at the front on a raised platform. His smile was triumphant when he saw them enter. "Ah, there are our guests of honor," Rogan announced loudly. "Please come to the front, everyone." Jonas remained standing when they reached the platform. "Let us get this over with, Rogan. Say what you came to say." "Very well, then." Rogan turned to the crowd. "Folks, we are here to discuss a matter of public safety. Mrs. Quinn stands accused of murdering her husband in cold blood. I think we all deserve to hear the facts before we allow a known killer to live freely among us." "She is not a killer," Elsie shouted suddenly. "She saved us. She saved our lives." Rogan's smile did not waver. "I am sure she seems nice, sweetheart. Bad people often do at first." "She deserves to tell her side," Jonas said firmly. "By all means, then." Rogan gestured toward Mara. "Please tell these good people your version of events, Mrs. Quinn." Mara stood slowly. Her hands were shaking, but her voice came out clear and steady. She told them everything. The violent marriage, Thomas's drinking and rage, the night he tried to kill her. She told them about grabbing the fireplace poker to defend herself, about his hands around her throat, about losing consciousness. And she told them about Rogan, about the gunshot that killed Thomas, about the sheriff's demands afterward, about his threats when she refused his advances, about the beatings in her cell when she would not cooperate. The hall erupted in chaos. People shouted questions and accusations. Rogan held up his hands with a wounded expression. "You see, folks, this is exactly what I warned you about. Mrs. Quinn is delusional, willing to accuse a lawman rather than admit her own guilt." "She is telling the truth," Jonas said. "Every word." "Can you prove any of it?" Rogan challenged. "Can you prove anything she said? Or should we just take the word of a murderer?" Jonas opened his mouth, but had nothing to offer. No proof, no evidence, just faith in Mara's story. He could see the crowd turning against them. They wanted to believe the sheriff. And then, from the back of the hall, a new voice cut through the noise. "I can prove every word she said. I have evidence." Every head turned toward the speaker. A man pushed through the crowd, tall and lean with dark hair going gray. He carried a leather satchel over his shoulder. His eyes were the same deep brown as Mara's own. Mara gasped in shock. "Rowan, is that really you?" The man's stern face softened with emotion. "Hello, little sister. Sorry I am so late getting here." Rowan Quinn moved through the stunned crowd until he reached the front of the hall. "I have been looking for you for 6 months, he told Mara quietly. "Ever since I heard about Thomas. I knew you did not kill him. So I started investigating." He turned to face the crowd. His voice grew commanding. My name is Rowan Quinn. I am a journalist for the Denver Chronicle. For 6 months I have been investigating the corruption in this sheriff's office. Rogan's face went pale. This is highly irregular, he sputtered. You cannot just make accusations. I can, when I have evidence, Rowan interrupted. He opened his satchel and pulled out papers and a small wooden recording device. I have witness statements, financial records showing payments from Sheriff Hale to criminals for false testimony, and most importantly, I have this, a wax cylinder recording made by Thomas Quinn 3 days before he died. The crowd fell silent. Thomas came to me terrified, Rowan continued. He said Rogan had been threatening him for months, demanding payments. When Thomas could not pay any more, Rogan threatened to take his wife instead. Thomas refused, and Rogan told him that one way or another he would have Mara Quinn, even if it meant putting Thomas in the ground. That is a fabrication, Rogan snarled. Then you will not mind if we play it, Rowan said calmly. He turned the crank on the device. Thomas Quinn's voice filled the hall, scratchy but unmistakable. My name is Thomas Quinn. I am recording this on March 10th, 1873. If you are hearing this, then something has happened to me. Sheriff Rogan Hale killed me. He has been harassing my wife for months. Tonight he came to my house drunk. He said one way or another he would have Mara. If I am dead, it is because Rogan murdered me. Do not let him hurt my wife. The recording ended with a sound like a gunshot. Silence filled the hall, every eye fixed on Sheriff Rogan. That is a lie, Rogan said desperately. His voice shook. The date matches exactly, Rowan said coldly. I also have witnesses who saw you enter the Quinn house that night, receipts for ammunition matching the bullet that killed Thomas, and testimony from 3 other women you harassed the same way. You are finished, Sheriff, and if there is justice in this world, you will hang. Rogan grabbed for his gun, but his own deputies seized his arms first. They wrenched the weapon away. Sheriff Hale, Deputy Ben Holloway, said formally, You are under arrest for murder. This is insane, Rogan screamed as they dragged him toward the door. I am the law here. You are the chaos, Ben said quietly. And you are done. Jonas pulled Mara close as the crowd erupted around them. She collapsed against him, sobbing. It is over, she kept whispering. It is finally over. Rowan approached and embraced his sister. I am sorry I was not here sooner, he said. You came when it mattered, Mara replied through her tears. You saved me. Rowan looked at Jonas over her shoulder. No, he saved you first. I just brought the proof. 3 months passed since that night. Autumn painted the ranch in gold and red. Sheriff Rogan was dead, shot while trying to escape transport to prison. Mara had become part of the fabric of their lives completely. The house bore her presence everywhere. Curtains she had sewn, gardens she had planted, laughter that filled rooms once silent with grief. One October evening, Jonas found her alone on the porch watching the sunset. Mind if I join you? He asked. Please. She smiled and made room beside her. They sat in comfortable silence. Then Mara spoke quietly. The twins asked me something today. When you were going to marry me properly, Jonas nearly choked. Mara laughed at his expression. They said we are already a family, that grown-ups should stop being foolish and make it official. Jonas felt his face flush, but then he grew serious. I have been thinking too, he admitted, about what we are, what we could be. He took her hands in his. When I first saw you in that square, something in me recognized something in you. these past months, watching you come alive again, watching you with my daughters. It changed something in me." "Jonas," Mara whispered. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because you saved my daughters, not because I feel responsible. I love you because you are the strongest person I know, because you make this house alive again, because when I imagine my future, you are always in it." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "I love you too," she said. "I have loved you for months. I was just afraid saying it would make it disappear." "Then marry me," Jonas said. "Not because anyone expects it. Marry me because we choose each other every day for the rest of our lives." "Yes," Mara said through her tears. 1,000 times yes. They were married 3 weeks later. Under the cottonwood trees by the creek, Rowan gave his sister away. The twins served as flower girls. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, the girls shouted absolutely not so loudly that birds fled the trees. Everyone laughed. That night they stood together on the porch, under the stars. "No regrets?" Jonas asked. "Not even one," Mara said. "You gave me my life back, a home, a family, a future I never thought I would have." "You gave us just as much," Jonas replied. "You made us whole again." 6 months later their son was born. They named him Rowan Thomas Kincaid, after the brother who saved them with truth, and the name they were reclaiming from tragedy. The twins sang to their baby brother the old melody about stars and rivers, passing hope to the next generation. This was their story, about justice twisted and truth revealed, about sacrifice and survival, about 2 little girls who saved their hero right back, but mostly about love. The kind that chooses, that fights, that refuses to give up. The kind that looked at a broken woman tied to a post and saw not a criminal, but family, and that made all the difference.